She paid for their home until her daughter snapped, "If you're not paying for everything, you're just taking up space." That's when Mom stopped being grandma and became the bookkeeper. Her name was on every contract venue canceled vendors gone. At the rehearsal dinner, a process server arrives and an email titled Final Accounting. The house isn't theirs, it's hers. Want to see justice served? You know, it's funny how a whole lifetime of love can be dismantled in a single sentence. For me, it happened on a Tuesday afternoon sitting in my daughter Jessica's immaculate gray and white living room. The air smelled of vanilla and ambition. Sunlight streamed through the plantation shutters, glinting off the crystal vase on the coffee table, a vase I'd bought them for their engagement. Everything was perfect, just like the life Jessica had so carefully constructed for herself and her fiancé, Kevin. We were going over the final details for their wedding. The wedding binder? A 3-inch thick monstrosity was open on the table between us. Jessica was the picture of the radiant bride-to-be, pointing to different tabs with a perfectly manicured finger. Kevin sat beside her, rubbing her back, the devoted partner. On the surface, we were a happy family, planning a happy day. But I'd been a bookkeeper for my husband's construction business for 40 years. I know how to read the fine print, not just on a contract, but on people's faces. They were talking about upgrading the dinner plates to a set with gold rims. Jessica said it would elevate the entire tablescape. Kevin agreed, saying it was those little details people remember. I just nodded a quiet, agreeable grandmother in the corner. I'd already agreed to the $50,000 budget. What was another few hundred for plates? I asked a simple question, my voice calm and practical. I wanted to know if the deposit on the new plates was refundable, if the guest count changed. Jessica just waved her hand, a little flick of the wrist that dismissed my concern entirely. She said not to worry about the boring details. That's what wedding planners were for. It was a pattern I'd noticed over the past few months. I was the bank, but I wasn't allowed to audit the books. I'd ask about contracts, about insurance, about gratuity policies, and they would smile at me with that gentle patience you reserve for a slightly confused child. They saw a sweet old lady who baked cookies and gardened, not the woman who once balanced the payroll for 50 men and negotiated with steel suppliers. I let them see what they wanted to see. At one point, Kevin's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and for a split second, the charming smile vanished. He excused himself and walked into the hallway, but he didn't close the door all the way. I'm not hard of hearing. I heard snippets of a hushed, tense conversation. I caught phrases like just the minimum payment and no new interviews, and the one that really stuck with me, I don't know how long we can keep this up. He came back a minute later, the smile plastered back on his face, but I saw the strain in his eyes. I saw the fine crack in their perfect facade. The final topic was the bar. They wanted a full, top-shelf, open bar. I suggested a more practical alternative, just beer and wine, maybe a signature cocktail. It would still be lovely, and it would save a few $1,000s. That was when it happened. That's when my practical suggestion pushed my daughter past some invisible limit. Jessica's face, usually so composed, tightened into a mask of pure frustration. The smile was gone, replaced by a sneer. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the vanilla-scented air. She told me the open bar wasn't negotiable. It was about showing their guests a good time, about maintaining a certain standard. I started to say something about standards of fiscal responsibility, but I never got the chance. The words that came out of her mouth next were the ones that echoed in the sudden dead silence of that perfect room, the words that ended everything. She leaned forward, her eyes flashing, and screamed, "The open bar is part of the budget we agreed to. If you're not going to pay for everything, then you're just taking up space in our house." Our house? The in-law suite I paid for. The down payment I provided. Our house. I didn't say a word. I just looked at her. I felt a strange calm settle over me like the eerie stillness before a tornado. All the love, all the warmth I felt just went cold. My face, I'm sure, was a complete blank. A placid mask. Inside, I wasn't a grandmother anymore. I was a bookkeeper, and I was about to close the books on this arrangement permanently. After Jessica's words hung in the air, I simply got up and walked to my part of the house, the in-law suite I had paid for in cash. I didn't slam the door. I closed it gently, the click of the latch sounding like the closing of a bank vault. I slept soundly that night, more soundly than I had in months. The anger didn't burn hot. It had cooled into something hard and clear like steel. The next morning, I made my coffee and sat at the small desk in my room. Through the window, I could see the rose bushes I'd planted, their buds tight and promising. My husband, Harry, always said, "Measure twice, cut once." He was talking about lumber, but I applied it to everything. For months, I had been measuring. Now it was time to cut. I opened my ledger. Not a fancy computer file, but a real leather-bound book with crisp, lined pages. In it, I had noted every single wedding expense, every vendor, every deposit. And next to each entry, I had the corresponding contract. My name, Martha Miller, was on every signature line. Jessica and Kevin had been too busy with cake tastings and floral arrangements to bother with the paperwork. They just told me who to write the checks to. A foolish, foolish oversight on their part. My first call was to the Willows, the ridiculously expensive venue with the weeping willow trees and the sterling silver cutlery. I was polite. I was firm. I cited the cancellation clause in the contract, which I knew by heart. The man on the other end was understanding. A non-refundable deposit was a non-refundable deposit. That was fine. It was a small price to pay for the return of my self-respect. I made 3 more calls after that to the caterer, the photographer, and the band. The cuts were clean, precise, and irreversible. I knew the call from my daughter would come. It happened around noon. My phone rang, and her name flashed on the screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering, taking a calm sip of my tea. Her voice was high and tight with panic, not anger. That was the first thing I noticed. The fear. She said the Willows had just called her to confirm the cancellation of her wedding date. She was talking fast, almost tripping over her words, explaining that there must have been a terrible mistake, some mix-up in their booking system. She wanted me to call them right away to straighten it out. She wasn't asking me if I'd done it. The possibility hadn't even entered her mind. In her world, I was a utility, a resource. And utilities don't just turn themselves off. I let her finish. Let the frantic energy exhaust itself into a breathless pause. Then, in the quietest, most placid voice I could manage, I told her the truth. I said it wasn't a mistake. I said I was the one who canceled it. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. I could almost hear the gears in her head grinding to a halt, the perfect image of her perfect life shattering like a dropped plate. Then came the sputtering, the disbelief turning to rage. She demanded to know why. How could I do this to her? It was her special day. I let her fury wash over me. It had no power anymore. I explained it to her in the simplest terms I could. I told her that when she screamed at me yesterday, she had redefined our relationship. It was no longer about a mother helping her daughter. It was a business transaction. And her screaming at me, telling me I was just taking up space, was a breach of contract. Our agreement, I told her, was based on a foundation of mutual respect, and she had personally demolished that foundation. She started to argue to try and twist the words, but I didn't let her. I had one more cut to make. I interrupted her. My voice still calm, still quiet, but with an edge of forged steel she had never heard before. I told her it wasn't just the venue. All the contracts were in my name, dear. The caterer, the photographer, the florist. All of them. We should talk about what that means." Then I hung up. I didn't give her a chance to respond. I sat there in the quiet of my room, the sun warming my face. The first move had been made. It was her turn on the board now, and I had a feeling she was just beginning to realize we weren't playing checkers anymore. For the rest of the day, a tense quiet settled over the house. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy silence of a Cold War. I stayed in my suite reading a novel, but my ears were tuned to the main house. I could hear the low murmur of voices, my daughter Jessica and my ex-husband, her father Frank. Frank was a man who operated on the principle of least resistance. He'd always let me handle the difficult things, the budgets, the discipline, the unpleasant phone calls. I knew without a doubt what they were doing. They were strategizing. They were planning how to handle me. I could picture the scene perfectly. Jessica pacing the living room, her face a storm of indignation and panic. Frank slumped in his recliner, trying to calm her down, telling her I was probably just having a senior moment, an emotional outburst. They would conclude that my actions were a cry for attention, a brief fit of pique that could be managed. Their strategy would be simple, a family intervention. They would sit me down, the two of them united, and employ a carefully crafted mix of guilt and feigned concern. They would talk about family, about forgiveness, about how much this wedding meant to everyone. They would try to make me feel small, irrational, and cruel. They thought they were dealing with a temper tantrum. They had no idea they were dealing with a balance sheet. The next morning, while they were likely still mapping out their emotional ambush, I slipped out of the house. I had my own meeting to attend. I drove downtown to a quiet, old-fashioned Italian restaurant, the kind with dark wood and white tablecloths, a place my husband Harry and I used to frequent. I was meeting David Chen Harry's lawyer, and after his passing, my own. David is sharp, impeccably dressed, and possesses a mind like a steel trap. He's about my age, and we share a deep, unspoken understanding of how the world really works. I didn't need to tell him the whole sordid story of the argument. I simply explained that the living arrangement with my daughter had become untenable, and I was exploring my options. He nodded slowly, his expression giving nothing away. He had already brought the relevant file. As the waiter poured our water, David opened a thick folder on the table, its label reading M&H Miller Family Trust. He walked me through it, though I already knew the contents by heart. Years ago, Harry and I, knowing our daughter's penchant for living beyond her means, had set up this trust. The money I had given Jessica for the in-law suite was actually the seed capital. The trust had purchased the entire property outright. Frank had signed away his rights to it in the divorce decades ago, happy to be free of the mortgage. Jessica and Kevin were in the driest legal terms tenants in a property I controlled completely. David confirmed my position wasn't just strong, it was ironclad. My move to cancel the vendors was a small thing, he noted. The real power I held was the house itself. As I sat there listening to David confirm my control, I thought about the sheer desperation that must be fueling my daughter. It wasn't just about a wedding. I pictured their lives, the ones they presented to the world, versus the one I suspected they were actually living. I saw stacks of unopened credit card bills on their kitchen counter, hidden beneath catalogs for designer furniture. I imagined the frantic shuffling of balances from one maxed-out card to another, the monthly dance of paying just enough to keep the wolves from the door. $80,000 in debt, that was the figure that felt right to me. A mountain of secret shame built from student loans they couldn't defer and a lifestyle they couldn't afford. That lavish wedding wasn't a celebration of love. It was a desperate theatrical production designed to convince the world and themselves that they were winning. When I got home later that afternoon, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Jessica and Frank were sitting in the living room, their faces arranged into expressions of solemn concern. The intervention was about to begin. They saw a confused old woman who had overreacted and needed to be brought back into the fold. They thought they had the power. They thought they could control the situation. I let them believe it. I walked in, sat down in my usual armchair, folded my hands in my lap, and waited for them to make their move, feeling the weight of the trust documents in my purse like a hidden set of aces. They started the intervention just as I expected. Frank, my ex-husband, took the lead, leaning forward with a pained expression he'd perfected over 40 years of avoiding conflict. He spoke in a low, reasonable tone, the one he always used when he was about to ask for something he didn't deserve. He talked about family unity, about how mothers and daughters are supposed to support each other, especially during a time as important as a wedding. He said my actions were hurtful and confusing and that he knew deep down I didn't mean it. He was trying to give me an easy way out, a way to apologize, and put everything back the way it was with me as the silent, open wallet. Then it was Jessica's turn. The anger from our phone call had been replaced by a carefully constructed performance of wounded fragility. Her eyes were glassy with unshed tears as she spoke about her dreams, about how this was supposed to be the happiest time of her life. She said she didn't understand what she'd done to deserve such cruelty. She made it sound as if my canceling the venue was a random, vicious act completely disconnected from the words she had hurled at me just the day before. They finished their little speeches and looked at me, a jury of two, waiting for the guilty party to confess her sins and beg for forgiveness. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, letting their accusations dissolve into the quiet of the room. I looked from my daughter's tear-streaked face to my ex-husband's concerned brow. Then I spoke. My voice was even devoid of the emotion they were trying so hard to manipulate. I told them I understood their position. Then I delivered the line I had rehearsed in my head all morning. I said the wedding was merely a symptom of a much larger problem. Before we could even begin to discuss vendors and deposits, I thought we should discuss their living situation first. The effect was immediate. The mask of wounded grief on Jessica's face was replaced by sheer confusion. Frank's brow furrowed, not with concern now, but with genuine bewilderment. They had come prepared for an emotional battle, and I had just changed the battlefield entirely. As they exchanged a confused glance, the doorbell rang, a clear, sharp chime that cut through the tension. I was the one who spoke, telling them I believed that was for me. I opened the door to find David Chen standing on the porch, his leather briefcase in hand. He looked calm, professional, and utterly out of place in this domestic drama. I invited him in. The sight of my lawyer walking into the living room sent a visible shockwave through the family. This was no longer an intervention. It was a formal proceeding. David didn't waste time with pleasantries. He set his briefcase on the coffee table, clicked it open, and produced a single thick document. He introduced himself to Frank and Jessica and explained he was the legal administrator for the M&H Miller Family Trust. He slid the document across the table. It was the deed to the house. Their house. He began to explain in dry, factual terms the nature of the trust my late husband and I had established. He detailed how the trust was the sole legal owner of the property at 24 Willow Creek Lane. I watched my daughter's face as David spoke. I saw the progression of emotions clear as day. First, annoyed confusion, as if this was some boring legal nonsense delaying her real agenda. Then a flicker of dawning comprehension, followed by a stark, bone-white terror. Her eyes darted from the legal document to my face and then back again. Her mouth opened slightly, and she whispered a single question, not to David, but to me. She asked if this was her house. David answered for me. He stated very clearly that it was the trust's house. She was a resident, but not the owner. I watched the last bit of color drain from her face. The truth had finally landed an emotional earthquake that shook the foundations of her entire life. Her hands began to tremble. Her perfect life, her perfect home, the very stage upon which she performed her success for the world, it was all an illusion. She didn't own it. She never had. Then David, without changing his tone, delivered the final blow. He mentioned almost casually that a property developer had recently made a very generous all-cash offer for this lot and the one next to it. He said that given the recent changes in the family dynamic, the primary trustee, me, was strongly considering accepting the offer. That was it. The final card in their house of cards was pulled away. This wasn't a negotiation about a wedding anymore. This wasn't something they could fix with guilt or emotional blackmail. An external financial force was now at the door, ready to bulldoze their lives. They stared at me, their faces a mixture of shock, horror, and for the first time, a glimmer of fear. They finally understood. I wasn't just taking up space. I owned the space, and I was about to have it cleared. The 2 weeks that followed the revelation in the living room were a strange sort of limbo. Jessica and her father treated me like a ghost, avoiding eye contact, speaking in hushed tones when they thought I couldn't hear. They were scrambling, trying to find a path forward, but every path they looked down was a dead end. The wedding was a ruin, their home was a property I controlled, and their perfect world had been exposed as a fragile fantasy. Still, Jessica was my daughter. I knew she wouldn't surrender without one last desperate attempt to save face. Her attempt came in the form of a reimagined rehearsal dinner. It wasn't at the grand hotel ballroom she'd originally booked, but in the private dining room of a respectable but much less glamorous downtown restaurant. She had gathered a small, strategic group of about a dozen people, her closest friends, her maid of honor, Kevin's parents. The goal was clearly to project an image of resilience, to spin a story of a downsized, more intimate wedding, a brave couple facing minor setbacks. I was invited, of course. My attendance was crucial to her performance, and I accepted. But I didn't sit at their long, boisterous table. My lawyer David and I took a small table for two in the corner, observing the scene like theater critics. My very presence created a low hum of tension in the room. Every laugh from their table sounded a little too loud, every smile a little too bright. They were performing for me, for each other, for themselves. Before the main courses arrived, Jessica made her move. She approached our table, her face pale, her smile a trembling, desperate thing. She leaned down, her voice a frantic whisper, begging me not to make a scene. She said we could still fix this, that she was sorry, that she would do anything. It was the plea of a cornered animal, but there was no real accountability in her words, only a desire to escape the consequences. I didn't respond. I simply looked at her, my expression calm and unreadable, and gently gestured for her to return to her guests. Her last hope flickered and died in her eyes as she walked away. She stood at the head of her table, glass in hand, to give a toast. Her voice was shaky as she started to speak about love, about resilience, about how true partnerships can weather any storm. It was a valiant, heartbreaking performance. And it was at that exact moment that I set my plan into its final motion. As Jessica was raising her glass, the door to the private room opened, and a man in a nondescript suit walked in. He moved with a quiet purpose, holding a long, white envelope. He approached their table and politely asked for Jessica Miller. The entire table fell silent. The man didn't say what it was about. He simply handed her the envelope, said, "You've been served," and walked out. Her hands trembled as she took it. At that precise second, I pressed send on my phone. Across the room, I saw her own phone light up on the table beside her plate. A new email had arrived. The subject line read, "Final accounting." She tore open the envelope first. Her eyes scanned the legal document, and I saw the last vestiges of her composure crumble. It was the official court-stamped 30-day notice to vacate the property at 24 Willow Creek Lane. As that reality sank in, her gaze fell to her phone. She swiped it open. She was now reading the email I had just sent, a meticulously itemized list of every canceled vendor, every forfeited deposit, and the final devastating sum of the wedding fund that had been transferred into a new trust account under my name alone. It was too much. The public humiliation of the eviction notice combined with the private digital finality of the financial cutoff broke her completely. A sound escaped her lips, a raw, guttural sob that had nothing to do with performance. The champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. And then the confession began. It wasn't a whisper. It was a torrent. The dam of her deceptions burst and everything poured out in a flood of tears and gasping breaths. She told everyone. She told them about Kevin losing his job 6 months ago. She told them about the $80,000 of credit card debt. She confessed that the entire wedding, the house, the life they were pretending to live, was a complete and utter lie. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, just to the horrified, silent room. All the pretense was gone, burned away by the harsh glare of the truth, leaving only the ugly, desperate reality. Kevin sat beside her, ashen-faced, a ghost, at the feast of his own downfall. I watched for a moment, and what I felt wasn't victory. It was a profound, hollowing sorrow. This was the consequence. This was the end of the line. Justice had been served cold and absolute, but the cost was the complete destruction of my daughter and the family I had once known. David placed a gentle hand on my arm. It was time to go. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. I took one last look at the scene, my daughter weeping in the ruins of her life, her friends and family frozen in shock, and I felt the full weight of the tragedy. My face, I am sure, showed no triumph, only the quiet finality of a chapter that was now finally closed. Then, without looking back, I walked out of the restaurant. The 30 days granted by the eviction notice passed in a blur of silence and strained civility. I kept to my suite, packing my life into boxes, while on the other side of the wall they dismantled theirs. There was no more yelling, no more desperate negotiations. The fight was over, and all that remained was the quiet, grim business of salvage and retreat. The first casualty of the new reality was Kevin. He was gone within 2 days of the restaurant disaster. He didn't say goodbye. He just vanished, his car and clothes gone in the middle of the night, leaving Jessica to face the wreckage alone. I can't say I was surprised. His love for my daughter was as flimsy as their financial statements. It was contingent on the illusion of success, and the moment the illusion shattered, so did he. My ex-husband, Frank, seemed to age 10 years in a month. The blustering, confident man I once knew was replaced by a hollowed-out shell. He helped Jessica pack, his movements slow and heavy, the defeat clinging to him like a shroud. He tried to speak to me once, catching me in the hallway. He started to say my name, but the words died in his throat. He just shook his head, a look of profound, weary sadness in his eyes, and shuffled away. There was nothing left to say. We were strangers living under the same roof, ghosts of a family that no longer existed. And Jessica. I barely saw her, but I could feel her presence. She was a shadow moving through the rooms, a ghost haunting a life that was no longer hers. The vibrant, ambitious woman was gone, replaced by someone broken. I took no pleasure in it. I had wanted accountability, not annihilation. But I had learned a long time ago that you can't control how a person reacts when their world falls apart. Some find strength. Others, like Jessica, simply crumble. The family unit, as I had known it, was utterly and irrevocably shattered. The gossip in town, I'm sure, was rampant. I heard whispers when I was at the grocery store, saw the curious glances from old neighbors. But the people who mattered, the friends who had known Harry and me for decades, seemed to understand. They didn't press for details. They just offered a kind word, a supportive hand on my arm. They saw a quiet, strong woman who had finally had enough, and they respected that. The story they told themselves was likely simpler than the truth, but the conclusion was the same. Martha Miller was not a woman to be trifled with. The day the moving truck came for my things was the same day the for sale sign went up in the yard with a large sold banner already slapped across it. I didn't watch Jessica and her father leave. I directed my movers, saw my life loaded into the truck, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. My new reality is quiet. It's a modern 2-bedroom condo on the 7th floor with a balcony that overlooks the city lights. It's smaller than the house, but it feels infinitely larger because it is entirely mine. The air doesn't smell of ambition and vanilla. It smells of fresh paint and new beginnings. I've started a small container garden on the balcony, rosemary, basil, and a few resilient tomato plants. The silence isn't heavy or tense. It's peaceful. I spend my days reading, listening to classical music, and having lunch with David or my old friends. I am not a vengeful woman. I am simply a woman who has reclaimed her space. Here in the quiet hum of the city, surrounded by my books and my memories of Harry, I am finally, truly at peace. I learned that a person's worth isn't measured by the space they occupy in a house, but by the respect they command in a relationship. For years, I had funded a fantasy believing my generosity was the same as love. I poured my resources into a foundation that I thought was made of family, only to find it was built on entitlement. Now I understand that real love requires respect as its most basic currency, and sometimes real justice is simply taking back the space you were told you no longer deserved. It's a quiet, profound act of repossession, not of property, but of self. And that's what true ownership looks like. In the end, Martha's story became a lesson in the true meaning of ownership. It began with the cruel accusation that she was merely taking up space, but it concluded with the quiet, unshakable truth that she owned all of it. More than a house or a bank account, she reclaimed her own dignity, and she learned that while love and generosity can be boundless, they must be built on the foundation of respect. When that foundation is shattered by those you hold dear, justice isn't about revenge. It's the simple, powerful act of reclaiming your space.